Hey, welcome to Collective Intellectualities. I'm Amy.
And I'm Alex, and today we have Jairus Grove, who is an associate professor of political science and the director of the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. And we are very excited to talk to Jairus today about his book, Savage Ecology, War and Geopolitics at the End of the World, and that's out on Duke University Press. So thank you for joining us today, Jairus. We're really quite excited to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So your book, Savage Ecology, is difficult to summarize. And at a surface level, it is an intervention into the field of international relations and the role of ecology within geopolitics and political violence. Or at least, it's a book at the intersection of these different dynamics, maybe we could say. At another level, it reads as somewhat as a user's guide to the future, or a speculative meditation on our catastrophic condition. And to begin, I want to read just a little fragment from the introduction, just to sort of set us up here. So Savage Ecology is a speculative reflection on the depths, nay, fathoms of shit we are in as a community of species. I'm certainly not alone in wanting to open up to the sheer magnitude of what confronts the planet, and yet I want to do so without losing sight of the real differences in politics, geography, history, meaning, and cosmology that modulate how each of us will confront the end of this epoch. In doing so, I hope to emphasize a refrain throughout the book that the end of the world is never the end of everything. An apocalypse is always more or less than an extinction. And whatever makes life out of the mess we are currently in will depend in some ways on how we come to understand the contemporary condition. So to begin, could you discuss how this refrain, the end of the world is never the end of everything, speaks to the overarching themes and problems laid out in Savage Ecology?
Sure, that's a great question. I think there were two different things I was trying to do kind of early on in the book. And the first is to kind of take the preciousness out of our current sense of doom. There's a sense that somehow this is like the first apocalypse that humans have faced. And I think that's a deeply depoliticizing move, and one that makes it all too easy to forget how much of the world is already post-apocalyptic, right? So, how much of the Americas and those peoples who were here before sustained European contact, right, had to overcome, 20 million people dying, right, their entire world becoming reforested, an ice age coming upon them. I can't imagine anything feeling more like an apocalypse than, watching that kind of death toll over that period of time, and it just literally changing the landscape of two continents. And similarly, during and in the immediate aftermath of the Middle Passage, right? I mean, you're almost double-digit portion of the total global population was moved and killed as a result of the slave trade. And so, those are scale sort of events which we make legible through history, right? We make them into something that's the Middle Passage, or it's the American Genocide, or right, and that sort of conceptual limit to it, I think, makes it easier to think about it as an event as opposed to an apocalypse. So part of what I wanted to do is say, no, like these have been apocalypses. The fact that we're still here isn't evidence that there wasn't an apocalypse. It's just evident that, again, that there's always something left over. And I think that was the sort of second move, which was to say that when we talk about, particularly when people talk about, the end of humanity, or, that climate change is going to end the planet, what they really mean is that it's going to end a particular version of human civilization, right? A particular model of political economy, of travel, of understanding modernity, right? Those things will become unsustainable. The probability that no life will exist on the planet is very low. It's not even just low, it's almost impossible. right? The Earth has been through a lot before, and that's not to discount all the violence and all the hurt that will come along with those transformations. But I think if you accept either of the two premises, which the Anthropocene is often premised on, one, that this is the sort of first great apocalypse of humanity, or that if we don't do something about it, it's the end, right? It's a sort of existential limit to the weird talking, thinking things that we are, then there's a lot of sort of political, sacralization of this modern period that I think is really dangerous. And so, I wanted to both, sort of up the apocalyptic tone of things, and in some sense also at the same time deflate the proprietary claim that I thought a particular sort of vanguard European group of states were making on that particular apocalypse.
Two, with the overarching themes, was also really interesting about the book with the apocalypse, but also how it's situated somewhat within geopolitics and also international relations. However, Luciani addressed this in the introduction, but it also represents a radical departure from mainstream international relations. And it examines geopolitics through ecological theory. And you draw attention to complexity and self-organizing systems while pushing against positivist approaches, right? The belief that we can measure, optimize, and quantify everything. And you write, concept creation, when combined with historical analysis and field research, can produce scholarship that is insightful beyond our ability to prove that it is insightful. So can you talk more about that, the methodological and analytical strategies that you develop in the book?
Yeah. Again, because I tend to always try to do things in pairs. I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to do is just make IR harder, right? I mean, geopolitics is the art and science of murder fundamentally. How do we dominate sort of initially in a catastrophic way that produces a crisis such that then we can renew a certain kind of order out of it, which can be maintained by a particular state, right? I mean, that's sort of the art and science of geopolitics. And so it's a weird field to be in, that to do your field well is to make that science better. and not better in any normative way at all, literally better at effectively dominating, producing a hegemonic order that can be maintained. And, I mean, I make a couple of jokes about this at the beginning of the book, but I really, like, it was not unusual to see Kissinger at my version of an international conference, like he's just like one of the guys, and honestly, one of the more moderate people in the room often. And that should tell you something about what kind of tradition that is. And so I often remind people, anthropology went through, I think, a really important bloodletting in the early 2000s, just after the invasion of Iraq, really thinking about the role that anthropology not had played classically, right? They'd already kind of come to grips with the way that early anthropology had been used to produce race science, but also to think about the way that anthropology was continuing to produce cultural knowledge for warfare. But in IR, you can't even have that conversation because, right, in anthropology, in some sense, that's a side effect. In IR, that's like what's on the back of the tin, like that's actually what IR was supposed to do. So, I think part of it was to be less useful, right, at sort of the outset. But then to think that IR does really have interesting questions, right? Like, what is it to say that we live in, at times, a global system? What were the conditions of possibility for making it global and planetary even? And also, how do we conceive of problems, which, they make a few appearances in the book, but they're the focus of the next book. Things like nuclear weapons, which, thinking about them locally is important. But there is no non-global consequence of a nuclear weapon, right? They have a sort of scalar efficacy that's just sort of mind-blowing, to be perfectly honest, bordering on the sublime. So I think I didn't want to leave the remains of IR incapable of thinking those questions. I mean, not that like I have that power, like, ooh, I could shatter IR, but so like there was the kind of, I think, traditional critical IR move of just wanting to make IR harder, what's the Foucault line, making facile gestures difficult. but there was this other part of me that also still wanted to be able to ask questions at the scale of that thinking. And so in that ways, I think I'm still very indebted to geopolitics, which is that geopolitics thought about ecological, political, and, you know, put it quite bluntly, power questions at scales larger than any one person could ever experience, right? They required this sort of prosthetic to a planetary scale. Because we have some problems which, if we don't think at that scale, I think become very hard to live with, you know, even if doing something about them never becomes possible. So, you know, insofar as there's a kind of reconstructive move in the book, I think it's that, which is, you know, could we imagine a world where international relations wasn't tantamount to doing geopolitics, right? And I'm wary of that, right? Because I don't want to rush to the recuperative and suddenly be in this place where, oh great, now we can just go do IR, right? And we're not doing geopolitics. But at the same time, like, that's where I am, right? You know, you find yourself in a field, and you find yourself with friends, and you find yourself in a series of questions, and you want it to be a like less horrible place. And I think that the book is trying to figure out how to do that without, you know, pushing the horror out, right? Like, can you make IR a place where you could have a life that is not premised on the lie that it can be functional or disconnected from that history?
So leading into a slightly different angle on these questions, so sort of on a parallel level to your critique of these positivist approaches or mainstream approaches, you're also challenging a faith within critical intellectual traditions that maintain a kind of fidelity to human liberation or emancipation or redemption. And, you know, throughout the book, you tarry with like Marxist perspectives at different times. So kind of have that in mind. In contrast, you advocate for a realist position with a basis in the real creativity and contingency that pervades the world. So could you discuss this notion of realism and the philosophical, ethical, and political dimensions you bring to it? And I don't know a lot about IR, it's not my field, but I also know that there's a realist tradition with IR, and it's within IR, and it's very, very different than the one that you're trying to articulate. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, maybe I'll do that in reverse order and start with the realism question. You know, no one who was critical in IR ever wanted to say they were a version of realism unless they were trying to save realism. And so a lot of the critical IR scholars that, you know, are a generation or two before me really wanted to think about something that was contra to realism. And as a result, the critique or the ethico-political critique of Realpolitik, right, of the sort of politics of realism, was often conflated with an epistemological critique of philosophical realism. And so the idea was that because they saw them as so intimately connected, then the best critical tool was to sort of sever them by showing exactly how weak an epistemological realism was. Right. So the critique of representation was thought to be kind of the sharpest knife, right, to stick realism with. I didn't want to let realism have realism. Right, like it's not theirs. They do it badly. In fact, realism very rarely holds on to any significant kind of encounter with the world. In fact, particularly what's called Neorealism in international relations, which was the move to kind of quantitative ways of modeling state behavior, was all about reductionism as a virtue, right? Removing ourselves from the world because the world distracts us from the fact that states more or less do the same thing, irrespective of whether or not they're communist or market liberal, or right, like that somehow states didn't matter. It was the international system that drove everything, and that's so patently absurd, right? Like at its base. And so I wasn't as interested in that kind of intervention into the politics of representation. I was interested in actually how the world does what it does, and I think that's pretty critical, right? So I think where I find sustenance for critique is very different than where the sort of first two generations of post-structuralist critique found sustenance. They found it in the incoherency or the unsustainability of epistemic realism. And for me, I found it in a much wilder realism, right? I wanted like a punk realism, right? That was willing to let the world be complex all by itself. And I think for me, ethically, that's also about seeing the role of critique coming from somewhere besides the author, right? So if you live in a kind of hermetically sealed post-structuralism, which isn't true of all critical IR people, but there was a kind of hermetically sealed post-structuralism where the critics sort of in charge, then I think you lose those opportunities for coalitions beyond the human species, beyond your own traditions, beyond the ways in which one doesn't have to articulate one's animosity towards geopolitics or its representational practices to be a critique of representation, right? And I wanted to avoid that, which is, I think, related, but not exactly synonymous with my animosity towards certain kinds of Marxism and certain kinds of liberatory politics, which I think comes more from the kind of work that Lauren Berlant's done on cruel optimism, which is that conceptions of revolution and transformation and liberation as the highest value, right? The kind of value for which then we'll peg all other values, right? It becomes an index for what we do. I think is really, kind of violent and torturous. Like there's just a lot of places that will never be liberated. And that doesn't mean that there won't be the creation of new values within those spaces. And I think that if liberation's the only way in which we conceive of the mark of success for what we do, then we lose those possibilities for kind of creative renewal. I would definitely never say make the world a better place. But I do like the idea that scholarship and thinking produces temporary spaces for joy or moments of solidarity or, connection points, which can be quite valuable. So like I love Marxists like, China Miéville and others who are doing like the journal Salvage, right? Their tagline for a while was bleak is the new red. And they were committed to Marxist critique because it was an important analytic for understanding particular practices of violence. They were not committed to a kind of revolutionary historicism as the means for which they would create other values, right? And so, they were like, they were sort of Marxist cyborgs, and I thought that was pretty cool. The last thing I'll say about that is that I also think that liberatory theory, when it falls into Kantian traps, meaning trying to take the value for transformation and making it universal, can't help but wipe the fingerprints off the 20th century's worst crimes. Like the reality is there are just a lot of people who don't want to be transformed. And it becomes very difficult within certain kinds of liberatory practices to see that obstinance as anything other than an enemy. And I think we see that right now. I mean, there are definitely, not a small number of kind of doctrinaire, very overconfident Marxist theorists. I won't overgeneralize, but they tend to be in their mid to early 60s and white, right? Who are at the sort of forefront of sympathy with things like TERFs, right? Because they don't like the way that trans theory disrupts certain conceptions they have of solidarity and notions of class. They tend to have a lot of animosity towards indigenous peoples because they think that their sort of unwillingness to see struggle as something universal, right? The desire to remain committed to place can be an obstacle to transformation. And I don't want a theory that makes enemies out of people who just want to like figure out a way to make life work. But I also take the critical point, which is how do you distinguish those people from the like survivalists in Montana who just want to be left alone? And I think the answer is you figure it out, right? I think there are ways to distinguish them, but it just as a move is not as interesting to me because I do think so much of violence is about homogenization, right? It's about a process of expansion and standardization, and it's hard not to see certain kinds of unmodified Marxist projects as being committed to that. And we see that in a lot of the sort of Marxist modernist projects, right? Like accelerationism, like left accelerationism. Certainly, I think even in some of the Marxist ecological arguments, right, because of the overdependence upon the limits or contradictions of capital to understand why ecological analysis can be productive towards political practice, there's still that desire for a kind of transformation which will consider itself incomplete unless everybody's on board. And I don't know, there's a little bit too much hubris there for me. So I think I have a very different idea of when I say something like critique, what it does, right? I kind of want to know how things work, and I want to know why people don't want people to know how things work, rather than trying to have a vision for how the planet could be ordered otherwise. And I think that's sort of the last thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up and you should ask me another question. But, you know, I will say a lot of my animosity towards a certain kind of formal Marxism comes from the way that it entered into international relations, in which it had a lot of methodological solidarity with realism. It just had a different vision of global order. And that made me a little anxious. And I think that's actually where, you know, really interesting people doing Marxist work like Glenn Coulthard, or, you know, other people who are working in sort of decolonial Marxist traditions or in ecological Marxist traditions, like this is where the theory has to go, which is that, you know, eventually you'll get asked the question, well, is there an order beyond your order, right? Is there a larger order for which this is all moving towards, which is to say that Marxism will always be confronted by a geopolitical question. And I don't think that most liberatory traditions have a very good geopolitical answer right now. And I think that can be incredibly dangerous. Yeah, I'll leave that there.
Actually, thanks for bringing, because you bring up another concept we wanted to discuss that you work through in your book, which is you call the Great Homogenization, and how you talk through where you'll say you're interested in how the world does what it does, but also how you distinguish between things that when you have this thing that you just want it to be homogenized. And another important concept related to the Great Homogenization, well, I'm sorry, I can't say that word today, not for Mondays. But another concept is you use the Eurocene, or you push the Eurocene rather than the Anthropocene. So why the Eurocene, and how does that help us understand homogenization?
Great. Yeah, I'm going to do that one backwards too, because I'll start with what the Eurocene is. You know, I think the Eurocene, the idea of the Eurocene, I'm not sure it's the best term. I just, I needed to call it something. So I can tell you where the discontent that sort of inspired the term came from, which was so much of the the Anthropocene was about rushing to a presumption, which is borrowed as this like bad folk Marxism, which is that if everyone could see, right, if we could overcome the false consciousness of individual or national problems and realize that we're all part of a global problem, which is, right, this ecological catastrophe, then we'd realize that like identity, place, all of these things don't matter, right? We're all in the Anthropocene together, right? That was the whole move of the Anthropocene, is to try to make it a universally human predicament, thinking that if we could make it a universally human predicament, then that would produce universally human responses. And, even in the early days of it, that was already like absurd, right? In part because so few of what count as humanity played a part in producing it, certainly in governing it or setting the agenda for it, and in benefiting from it, right? Like this is a good Marxist moment, right? Like who benefited, and the question is quite clear. And so it wasn't a human problem. And so that was sort of part one. Part two was, I also thought that the Anthropocene was more a kind of move, like almost a backhanded compliment in reverse, right? And what I mean by that is that the Anthropocene was a way of also proclaiming just the sheer magnitude of humanity. Like, look at how awesome humanity is. We wrecked a whole planet. And people are like, oh no, no one means that. And the reality is that we're already seeing how quickly that's become true, right? Like geoengineering is already reaching pretty common political discourse, right? We're seeing it at the United Nations, the European Union has embraced it. What did Bill Gates say 2 days ago? We need like thousands of Elon Musks to solve climate change. it's like my nightmare. I'm never going to unsee that. So, you know, at the very moment that it tries to recuperate who the human is, it does so not in a debt to the violence it caused, but in some sense as a kind of power grab for how decision making should get made at a global scale. And you immediately see that in the kind of text that you know, people arguing for geoengineering right about, well, we can't wait for politics. Politics is too slow. Democracy is too slow. We can't get a global, you know, sort of consensus on what to do about climate change. So we have to make the most of US imperial power. We have to make the most of, you know, kind of Chinese authority. And we need solutions for ecological crisis, which in some sense are native to authoritarianism, right? Because that's what's going to be necessary to really make a difference. Or, you know, the kind of neoliberal turned libertarian version of that, right? We need 1,000 Elon Musks. We need people who have fought for their freedom from government regulation, have amassed the capital and the creative capital necessary. They've been chosen by the Calvinist market to have the wherewithal to alter the planet without the confines, right, of institutions or democratic accountability, or you know, worrying that if they make a mistake, everyone in the Pacific will die of starvation. So I think that's, you know, if you call it the Anthropocene, you lose sight of those particularities. I think calling it the Eurocene for me was a way of trying to make it clear that those aren't unforeseeable outcomes once they call it the Anthropocene, because given the context of where that era came from, right, the kind of vanguard European geopolitics, which established the international order as it exists, right, both in the initial sort of phases of settler colonialism, but then also in the rise of sort of global scale states, and then in the building of the post-World War II international order. Of course, right, they were going to re-articulate, right, international crises in a context that made sense, right, that was plug and play for a certain kind of international geopolitics. And I think we should just call that what it is, right? And until we call that what it is, and you know, that I basically came up with that term because I was asked to do this debate for the Boston Review. So myself and Vandana Shiva and gosh, who else was part of that? David Keith and a few others were asked to respond to Jedediah Purdy's book on the good Anthropocene. And he had this sort of like FDR vision of the Anthropocene. And, you know, like it's hard to hate Purdy. Like he means too well. But at the same time, thinking that FDR was a great model, right? That sort of way, which, you know, you can extrapolate that all the way to the Green New Deal, totally discounts what made it possible for something like FDR to take place. Not just the place that it took place, right, which required immense genocide, but the kind of expropriation of labor value from other countries, the shifting from coal to oil, right, the kinds of transformations which had catastrophic, right, consequences around the planet, so that it was possible to redistribute wealth within one particular territory. So, you know, I was butting up against that. And at the same time, I was also butting up against who was starting to take an interest. So, you know, myself and Alex Williams and Nick Cernacek were all in grad school at the same time, and they just written that sort of first accelerationist manifesto. And they were really excited with this sort of flippant comment that Frederick Jameson had made about the same time, that what the left needed was their own version of Walmart, right? That the thing that would make communism work this time around was global supply chains and the kind of optimization algorithms which made Walmart so efficient we could do, but like in the key of justice, right? And that was terrifying to me, right? Like the idea of global Walmart communism, right? That's not liberation, right? That's just taking more resources. And I think this is one of those problems where there is a sense where we have to think about labor in a more interesting way. And we don't if we take some of these things for granted. So, you know, if you take a kind of unredemptive view of what Marx means about labor being sort of the, you know, like labor after capitalism as being the unleashing of labor's potential, then that's a disaster from the perspective of resources, right? Like there would be nothing worse than if people weren't alienated from their jobs. We'd be like 3 times more productive, and the planet would die in like 15 minutes. There are other ways we could do it though, right? Like, so think about like some of that later work that Marcuse did on like in an essay on liberation, where he wants to rethink labor as just creative joy, right? How could we come to understand what Marx means, not as productivity, like output, but in the crafting of new selves, right? In the creation of values which don't have even intrinsic value, right? They don't even really have a sense of value as we could understand intersubjectively. They're only sort of valuable in the minute, right? Called it like an erotics of labor. Then maybe, but then that's not Walmart communism, right? That's something very different. And so, I think I wanted a way for those people who thought they were already hip enough to like not have to talk about settler colonialism because they weren't in favor of it, right? To think about how their ways of seemingly escaping its limits were going to reproduce it. And I think that's important. I mean, I think that gets lost in the concept of the Anthropocene. And I also think it gets lost if we don't understand this intimacy between homogenization and transformation. And, like I want things to be better, I guess, as much as the next person. I've got kids and I have debt and, I work all the time and I can barely sleep and I have anxiety and I have all those things. So yeah, better would be better. But I also want a critical place where if better means transformation, I'll pass, right? I'll find other ways, to make things a little bit better. And I think it's hard once we enter into liberatory spaces to not quickly fall back into that gesture of, if we can just do this critical thing, right? Then, right, it can be better for everybody, right? It's not true, right? There's finitude in the world. And I think we have to think about what liberation means in those terms. And I think that's been a bit lost. So I guess that's what I'm trying to push. That and the fact that, still to this day, right, Europe and the United States has produced the majority of the carbon on the planet. China still hasn't even come close to catching up. The US and Russia basically have 97% of all the nuclear weapons on the planet. Right? Like, we're not really in this kind of post-imperial world in any real sense, even with the advent of the BRICS countries. And I think that's another move which I'm a bit skeptical of. People are like, oh, aren't you being awfully hard on the US? Like, don't we really need to think about India and China and all these other places? And sure, yeah, we should think about those places. Modi's a fascist. Xi is, a nightmare, deep fried in a catastrophe. But right, like, that's not where I am, right? I don't have the same kind of responsibility, I think, for the easy, facile gestures of Modi and Xi as I do for the easy, facile gestures of Biden and Trump and Obama. And so I would rather think about the way that we're still very much making the agenda, and what that means for, where, because intellectual labor is finite too, right? Right, we can't be critical. We can't be critiques, to all people, right? We can only be critical at certain places. And so I guess that's where my critical priority is in that particular Europeanization of homogenization, even though, like, obviously that's taking place in Uyghur death camps right now. Although, I would want to ask the question, hey, rounding people up and putting them in camps, wherever did you get that idea?
So yeah, a little bit further on that note, you make the argument that political violence is the primary driving force of the great homogenization.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that comes through in the kind of world that you've been describing over the last 15 or 20 minutes or so. So you make this argument around political violence being the primary driver of the great homogenization rather than traditional or Marxist approaches to imperialism.
Yeah.
Why this emphasis on political violence rather than, say, capitalism or even the optimizing drives of technological evolution? I think you've been speaking to this question already. But just to tilt your attention a little bit more toward war, which is so central to your project, why is it crucial to think about war as a form of life within the Great Homogenization? And what is a Marshall ecology of the Eurocene?
Yeah, this one's just straight stolen from one of my advisors, Daniel Dudney, which is that I replaced modes of production with modes of destruction. And there's a reason for that. So there's a historical reason, which is that I don't actually think that proto-capitalism explains the first 100 years of settler colonialism that are pre-capitalist. I think you have to have a better explanation for that, in part because it was such a disaster. Like it was not in any way useful. It was exuberant, but it wasn't useful, right? We didn't find the gold we were looking for. We didn't produce crops like we'd hoped. The first 100 years of settler colonialism were mostly people freezing to death and eating each other. And they still kept coming back for more. And that's interesting, right? It's interesting that settler colonialism worked as a mode of production before it worked as a mode of production for capital. So that's sort of point one. And that'll become interesting in a second when I get to point three.
Jairus, I'm sorry. Just explain that. Yeah. Settler colonialism became a mode of production.
Yeah.
In what sense are you differentiating these two different modes, one of capital, one of settler?
Yeah, because it couldn't produce value, right? It was just a total value suck, but it reproduced itself. So one of the things I think is really important about mode of production as a concept is that it's a way for Marx to do early complexity theory before he had a lot of the concepts for it, which is that he needs something like what Simondon would call a logic of individuation, meaning how could something become fundamental and not be articulated, whereby social relations and political relations and relations of war will reproduce themselves over and over and over again without having to have central organization, right? Like for me, that's the power of mode of production. Is it gives us an explanatory tool for understanding the reproduction of order. But one of the central drivers, right, because there's all these forces, right, it's an energetic system for Marx, is the production of value, right? So you need it because if capitalism can't produce value in the form of profit, right, from surplus, right, value from labor, then there's nothing to reinvest in the system to explain it being expansionist, right? Then it should actually almost be equilibrium-like rather than having this massive, explosive, creative character. It should just sort of hold still. And the interesting thing is it was explosive and exuberant before, and in fact for almost a century, before it ever figured out how to produce value. And that to me is really interesting. And I don't think that I think people have worked really hard at trying to explain this. So you look at particularly a lot of the longue durée Marxists, right? They try to give an account of mercantilism and also like the state form as being an early driver to that. But what's remarkable is you get up close and you look at the kinds of people who wanted to flourish in the New World, and they weren't state driven in that way. They weren't even necessarily that driven by riches. They were, not to be overly Nietzschean about it, but they just loved killing people and telling them what to do. I've read their diaries and I reproduced some of the diaries in the book, but there's an exuberance in the sadism of settler colonialism. And so I'm trying to draw attention, and that's why I said point one relates to point three, but now I'm going to skip point two and come back to it in a minute, which is that I think that you can have a political economy of sadism, which is not a capitalist economy, meaning you can have techniques of capitalism, you can have productive forces of capitalism without having to be as dependent upon value from labor as Marx would have. And so that's because I take a healthy dose of Bataille and dump him back into Marx. And I can imagine, right, potlatch economies, and the potlatch is torment, right, is torture. And so I don't need just capital to explain people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. I also need this other economy of desire, which is a political economy, but it is not the political economy of capital. entirely.
So sorry. So
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
I mean, I can imagine responses to this, which would be,
Sure.
you know, Europe was still transitioning from feudalism to capitalism in the 16th century.
Sure.
So the primitive accumulation, the forms of violence that were taking place during that century, were the foundation for
Yeah.
The development of capitalism itself, and
Yeah.
also for the emergent world order that capital creates.
Yeah. But
So
there's almost no primitive accumulation in that first 100 years.
okay,
Like
explain that, and because I can only imagine that Marxists would be like, well,
yeah.
it's violence was always there from the beginning. So you're differentiating two things that shouldn't actually be differentiated.
So for Marxists, though, the violence is only a means to the accumulation. It's not the ends. And for me, I think what they were accumulating was sadism. They were accumulating violence. And eventually, accumulating violence produced the accumulation of wealth, right? Property, raw materials. But for the entire period of the Little Ice Age, it did exactly the opposite. At best, during the first 40 years of the Little Ice Age, all it did is provide a pressure valve, a relief from Europe, from the people who were fleeing the fact that agriculture was collapsing in Europe as well because of the Little Ice Age. So productivity levels during that sort of late neo-feudal European period were no longer able to produce surplus. And so you have political unrest, and you have like starvation, and then you have a bunch of people who are willing to get on boats thinking there's going to be a better life. But the reality is that most of the people pushing them onto the boats, like, they just like doing it. And so, you know, I think that there is something strangely de-eroticizing, in the same way that in Marxism we often mean depoliticizing, from understanding primitive accumulation as merely having that rational ends, whereby violence was just the most efficient means of taking value from something else, because there was no value taken. Most of the people didn't come back with gold. Most of the people couldn't even hold on to property. There weren't a bunch of resources waiting for them, and they just kept it up. And they kept it up for a very, very long time before there was anything like accumulation. And that seems a little strange for me. I don't think that there's an easy Marxist explanation for that, other than, you know, like where we normally understand the desire for profit through alienation, and, you know, kind of like the more subjectivity-based arguments that we can extract from Marx. But I don't think that's enough. And I also think there's a reason for amplifying that in particular. Given, I think we're entering into another stage very similar to that in outer space, and in the ways of trying to extract value from things like bioprospecting and the kind of production of new forms of life, and in, you know, longevity, and these other ways where it has to be retrofit to capital, because that's the way that they're producing the resources to do it. But capital is not its only motivation by any stretch of the imagination, and in fact, quite the opposite. So that's sort of part one. Part two is Marxists very rarely understand the logics of martial economies as well as they understand the logics of civilian economies, and they try to bifurcate them. And these were all martial economies. And, you know, I mean, I make a quip in the book that, you know, everybody wants to talk about double entry bookkeeping because that's the only way you can measure profit, and you can create interest, and, you know, do the things that we think of as being the inheritance of modern capital. But, you know, for me, the reality is, you know, this is like puts me on the slightly more Heideggerian side, you know, and why I like Marcuse probably. But, you know, I think interchangeable parts. I think homogenization, the capacity to mobilize labor in ways where skill, artisanship is not significant, is actually the driving force, right? And so Marx sees that as an effect of the desire to produce capital, not what makes capital possible. And it's not outside for me, the realm of possibility that we missed entirely that all the early factories only made one thing. They made guns. The first patent for movable parts was for the rifle. And in fact, the desire to create patents in the Americas, because that's where they were invented, was to protect the first rifle as being something that could, you know, could bring a certain kind of proprietary claim to the rifle maker, and was set up as the first thing that was mass produced. So, you know, war has a very different relationship to value. And, I mean, there are some people who obviously dove into this. I don't end up in the same place, but this is part of Schumpeter's argument about creative destruction, which becomes really important to 20th century Marxists. But I think it's more than that. So creative destruction can fully be articulated within a Marxist worldview if we understand it as only this kind of process of expanding markets or building new markets, or trying to get rid of the kind of recalcitrance of labor forms. But what it doesn't explain is that there are a lot of people who fight wars to fight wars. They actually like the thrill of war. And so for me, particularly with the rise of state fascism, but also the recurrence of militarized fascism that doesn't always have to have a state form, we have to understand war as a distinct logic from logics of economy. And that gets back to the kind of Bataille, desire for expenditure that doesn't make sense in some sense purely within a Marxist form. And strangely, what it's most akin to is what labor looks like after capital. So martial labor, particularly when it's just fully unleashed, looks a lot like Marx's labor when we've overcome the alienation from the capital form, where it's just unbounded, right? It's just this sort of pure desire, which meets itself in the kind of homo faber, species being. That's how a lot of people feel about war, right? The first time you put an M16 in their hand, they're just like, God, I've been waiting for this my whole life. And those are some of the people I'm studying in the book. Are these people who, even when wars are over, the first thing they do is figure out how to get paid to do it. And they're like, oh, we'll get paid. Well, then that's just labor. But what's remarkable is when you study a lot of these private military corporations, they run at a loss. A lot of them will do it to lose money just to get back to the fight, right? Like they're not doing war to make money. They're trying to get money so they can do war. And I think that has to be understood as being distinctive as a way of organizing politics. And I think we have lots of historical examples where we've seen that take place. And this is, again, I think part of the reticence versus the way that Marxism entered in international relations. Marxist IR people were just as willing to accept deterrence theory within the nuclear paradigm as the sort of capitalist, state form. And the reason why is because they thought that they were both fundamentally rational, right? They believed in rationality as a kind of ordering principle. And the problem is, you actually go look at the people who built these weapons, and they were psyched that they were going to get used. They thought that it might jumpstart human evolution. There were a lot of people in the United States that were excited that the Russians were going to strike counter value targets because those were all cities rather than military. And the US could, in the words of the president of Harvard at the time, James Conant, it would be a kind of win-win, where because of white flight and because of the unsuccess of busing, that in a nuclear war, Russia would lose its intellectual centers and the United States would just lose its Black population. And then that would, that the future, according to him, were in new cities like Bakersfield, California, and these other small 10 to 60,000 person cities that had been created precisely fleeing the race riots of the 60s. That's not a capitalist logic. It's embedded in capitalism and it uses capitalism to reproduce itself, but like that kind of accelerationist drive to recreate humanity and whiteness and go to the stars and do it with atom bombs, like for me that's weird enough to explain differently. Maybe that's the best way to put it.
So a mode of destruction. So I would like to ask one more question here on this because I just would find it interesting. So you're describing a number of different things, but a martial ecology has to take into consideration, obviously you're not satisfied with some sort of Marxist reduction to capital and that specific production of value or even forms of labor. You're looking at sort of economies of emotional economies of desire, as you said, like economies of sadism, the production of sadism. How does the martial ecology that we are sort of, I don't know, there's a lot of people who want to talk about this moment, this historical moment, as one of sort of transition from, you know, high neoliberalism of like, you know, the late 90s and early 2000s moving into some other sort of political economic dispensation. And obviously climate change, all the attendant sort of intensities that are associated with that are part of this. What I'm trying to get at here is how are these dynamics of a Marshall ecology sort of changing and shifting and modulating at this moment? And where do you sort of see them headed?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I will actually, you know, it's already all about my book, so I shouldn't give shout outs to more things, but I just wrote this piece called From Geopolitics to Geotechnics for the Journal of International Relations. And I talk a little bit about what those futures could look like. So people could check that out if they wanted to. The short answer is this, like, I'm obviously indebted to Marxism, right? There is no better account of the transformation of political economy, full stop, right? It's super cool. There's all kinds of useful things. However, for the same reason that I think that there were modes of destruction that predate the mode of production of capital, I think we can also see the emergence of modes of destruction taking over again. And I think these are, and I say this in the article, very much in parallel to the way that somebody like Asho Bembe talks about necropolitics as being distinctive from biopolitics. So for me, biopolitics is really at home in capital and is mostly at home in late stage neoliberalism, but is not exactly at home in some interesting phenomena that are happening. So I'll give it just an example, which maybe is better than trying to explain all of it. So if you're, interestingly, if you're a good like neoclassical economist or you're a good Marxist, then the automation of labor doesn't scare you too much. And one of the reasons is because Jeffrey Sachs will basically make the Marxist argument, in fact he did, that the automation of labor hits a wall and a limit because wages are the only way that we know how to rationally redistribute wealth. And as a result, you won't be able to produce the consumer power necessary to sustain capitalism if you automate too much, right? So in a certain sense, like, you know, don't freak out, there's a net. And the Marxists will say the same thing, right? They'll say that like ultimately capitalism can't live without labor because, you know, and Marx makes this argument about machines, but people have updated it, right? You can't get surplus value, labor value from machines because, you know, all these very different reasons, which have a lot to do with machines degrading and not being able to reproduce themselves. And but by the way, you know, if they start reproducing themselves, that already gets
declining rate of profit.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like it's more than the standard declining rate of profit argument, right? It's actually that like machines have a faster declining rate of profit because of the nature, and also but part of the conceit of that argument, like if you go to the footnote in the abstract on machines, one of the things he says is because who are you going to pay to fix them? Is one of the sort of like warrants for the claim he makes, and the answer is, well, you're not. You're going to have machines fix machines, right? So he doesn't think through the generative capability of algorithmic machine learning as a capacity for machines to reproduce themselves. So that's sort of part one. And that's underdeveloped. But there's still the sort of Sachs-Marx argument, right? Which is that, well, what are you going to, like, who's going to buy the stuff? Why would you bother? And that's where I think the kind of Marshall ecology comes in. If there are other ways of producing value, which are not premised on consumer value, or rather consumer demand, like getting to Mars, like making people live forever, or like tormenting people in other countries because it's an interesting thing to do, right? These kinds of the productions of sadistic value, which are another version of surplus value, but they're produced through pain or through killing or through abandonment or through clearing, right? Like literally just emptying spaces out. Or turning them into things, right? The possibility of human bodies having value in their substance rather than in their labor, which is, I think, particularly terrifying, but not impossible. And something that indigenous people are already experiencing with bioprospecting, right? Where their genetic diversity is more significant than their labor power. And so how we'll come to understand their bodies is something we can archive as opposed to something we have to keep alive. That's a good example of a kind of transformation in the relationship between a body and labor power, which can happen if capitalism is a form that's incredibly powerful, but it's not a law. And I think that's the difference. So it's not that I'm contra Marx, it's just that I'm contra the sort of totality of capitalism and its other in terms of where value comes from. And part of that too is also a bit of unease with the way that species being works in Marx, which plenty of Marxists have cleaned up, but they've cleaned it up in a way which I think still is open to this problem, which is there may not be a net with automation. We may not care, right, that there's no way to generate profit from these things. And you read the kind of apocalyptic texts that people like Thiel and other right-wing accelerationists read and talk about, and they're kind of okay with just the massive catastrophe of the economy and like leaving this planet behind and leaving it in ruins, and even toying with it, experimenting with it. And that's also sort of related to the next book, which is, I think experimentation, like experimentalism, is within the realm of capital for sure right now, but is entering into the martial ecology more significantly and produces value in its experimentation, not because of the use of what the experiment produces. So playing with bodies, altering life, gaining a certain kind of efficacy over plasticity. These things can produce value even if they don't produce profit. And we have to think about what we're going to call that new term, where what we mean by profit is not something that can be reinvested into capital, but is like the residue and scabs of pain and torment, which are in themselves valuable, right? They produce joy for really creepy, people hell-bent on doing these things. And, I wish that were like sci-fi, but like, those are the people who funded Trump's campaign. Thiel funded the last 6 months of Trump's campaign. Those are the people that we're saying can save us from climate change, right? So yeah, so does that help? So yeah, I think it's not that capital isn't formative. It's also not that capital isn't dominant or hegemonic, but I can already see these other kinds of economies that were there at the beginning of settler colonialism bubbling back up and gaining not autonomy from capital, but semi-autonomy, right? And that semi-autonomy, I think, is really important. One, for where capital gets driven in its late stages, and also what emerges out of it, which, I wish were communism, but yeah. I don't know, does that help?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's great. We're gonna transition a little bit away from martial ecologies, I suppose, and ask you a couple of questions that are a little bit different.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and it's kind of going into, you got into a little bit with the university, but also talking about useless theory. And so in your book, because we're also like, we're interested in education, but you begin Savage Ecology by stating that this book wasn't supposed to be written. And so could you elaborate on those educational experiences and how they've informed your life and your intellectual work? Because I think that's also kind of a running undercurrent of this conversation so far.
Yeah.
So helping through that.
I mean, I hated school, having severe learning disabilities before the ADA was like a nightmare. It was a nightmare for my mom. It was a nightmare for me. It was always the luck of the draw of whether or not I was going to get somebody who did their best effort to help me, or somebody who just like used me as an example for the rest of the class of what an idiot was. And I experienced a lot of sadism in school. Teachers who were like offended that I seemed articulate and intelligent at one cut, that I would put into the "you think you're so fancy, huh" category. And then incapable in writing, because I'm dysgraphic and I have some other learning disabilities. So, it produced, terror. It just meant like going to school made me physically ill most days. And so it's a little weird to like end up an academic when your entire encounter with school, really, until you got to college, was horrifying. It was awful. And, I think about, in particular in high school, there was one moment I had a math teacher named Miss Cantu who called my mom, and my mom was like in tears, and I was like, "What's wrong, Mom?" And she was like, "Oh, your teacher just yelled at me that like you have no business being in school. like the best thing that you could hope for is that maybe you'll finish one more year of high school, and that I should really start looking for like a remedial program for you, like something, you know, like you can learn a trade. And not that there's anything wrong with learning a trade, but like, you know, this is my sophomore year. Like I already read Critique of Pure Reason, and I'd like gotten all the other cool books I could find at the library that were about philosophy. Like that's not what I wanted, you know, like that's not where I was going. And, you know, it seemed like school was going to be a dead end. And so that was an experience of homogenization. I couldn't produce knowledge back, right? Like that sort of banking model of education. I couldn't produce the other side of that currency exchange in the way that they wanted me to. In part because I literally physically couldn't write, you know, and they wouldn't let me use a computer in the classroom because that was cheating. And, you know, I remember I wrote our junior year of high school, we had to write our first like serious research paper. And I wrote it on Bakunin and Ayn Rand, and why Ayn Rand misunderstood the concept of freedom, and why I thought Bakunin, you know, had it kind of nailed, and, you know, like where that sort of misunderstanding was between libertarianism and anarchism, and, you know, like why I thought Rand would always end up in this strangely authoritarian place, right? Even though, right, it was a desire to escape the state. I thought that was pretty cool for a junior in high school. I turned in this paper. It was 32 pages long. My mom weirdly found a copy of it recently when she moved, which is why I'm thinking about it. And we got 2 grades back for the paper. One grade was the content grade, for which I got 100. And the other grade that the content grade was above was the grade for mechanics and grammar. And I got a minus 272. And so the teacher had basically made sure that my paper failed, right? Like there was no way for the content to exceed the mechanics. There's just nothing I could do, right? I literally, and it like, if you're going to give someone a minus 272, like giving them the 100 is really just spite, right? It's to say, you know, you thought you had this, but you will never like dig yourself up out of this problem. And, you know, it's hard not to see the way that the emergence of American education after World War II is this sort of like, what's it supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be this cauldron where we learn how to separate winners and losers, and where teachers are in some sense rewarded for finding the best of the best, and then taught to bemoan when they have to manage those who are not, right, in that class. And so, you know, like, it was definitely my first encounter with the Eurocene, but I think it's an essential part of the Eurocene. I think education is one of those ways where we reproduce those forms. And I mean that in a kind of like Whiteheadian and Deleuzian sense, right? Because they're incredibly plastic forms. So yes, they can go directly into capital, but they also find their ways directly into domestic violence. They find their ways into racial profiling, right? Those logics of organizing difference and creating value, I think we start that pedagogy like basically the first day of kindergarten, you know? I remember like even in kindergarten, there were reading groups and everyone knew, like even at the age of 5, everyone knew, right? Like the butterfly group was better than the donkey group, right? And it had to do with how well you could read, right?
Clearly,
yeah,
clearly the butterfly group is better, definitely.
Yeah, right. But I'm already saying like what's amazing is like I had a great teacher in kindergarten. You know, I'm sure she just inherited that from like whoever had done her bulletin board, you know, the year before. But so like for me, theory is always pedagogy. Because for me, pedagogy is where violence reproduces itself, and it's also where critical tools come in. And so, you know, it was the couple of good teachers who said, this stuff you can't do. I only want to see this stuff from you. And they knew why they were doing it, right? You know, like one of them because their son had pretty severe dyslexia. One of them just because he thought it was hilarious that I was reading Scientific American like in junior high, and you know I was a super science nerd, and so instead of like giving me exams in the same way, he would be like, "You're teaching class today on recombinant DNA." He's like, "I saw you reading that," you know, and then you know like I felt like $1 million until I got to the next class. Right, those kinds of moments of pedagogy too, right? Like those are the ones that make you think, you know, screw all the rest of the teachers. I'm going to college, and I'll find some of the things. And then, you bump into some of those same jerks in college too. But like, there's something amazing that happens when you get to the university, and there's still some people around that care about ideas, and they haven't been abused by the formalism of curriculum planning. And they're just sort of excited to see somebody who's as excited about ideas as they are. And so, like, I was lucky in that I made it through. And also I was lucky I was in a state with a land grant school where there were still ideas, right? I was in Texas. My grades were terrible. But at that time, if you scored well on the SAT, you automatically got into the university. And they had this like sliding scale. So, like, I think I had to get a minimum score of a 1490, which was like only 100 points away from perfect on the SAT to even get in with my grade point average. But, like, whatever, I pulled off the score, and there are all sorts of reasons, I'm sure, like, I can access standardized tests in a way that others couldn't. But for whatever reason, like, that didn't resonate with my learning disability in a negative way. But then once I got there, that, like, the university seemed like just this like wholly other space. And I think that had a lot to do with why I have, a kind of romantic view of what the university can be as a kind of refuge, because like in Texas, again, UT Austin isn't just like a refuge for ideas. It's like also a refuge for justice. It's like, like it was so much less conservative than everywhere else, like it could be this place where we could experiment with music, and we could experiment with ideas, and you could come across weird books you weren't supposed to read, and, find yourself into strange conversations with people. And so, and it was public, right? It was like something that, I could figure out how to afford. It was $1,200 a semester when I went to UT, and that was only 20 years ago. Like that like was something valuable. And so I, from that, I think I inherit a kind of sense that, for all of its problems, right? There were tons of problems there too, but, there's something about the university, and there's something about it being made accessible and wild, right? Not, the other thing about UT is it's enormous. It's 60,000 people. Like, nobody could impose a vision of what UT was supposed to be on UT, like if you had an army, and those things mattered, right? And I think those were really formative for me, for sure.
And then going to that, because I like how you pointed to, like, there is how the martial ecology is already infused in those in curriculum, especially where it tries to forces you to be certain people, or like whoever this like ideal student is. But also you point to the refuge of the university and having that. And so you also stated that to study the world as it is a means to care for it. And being in the world, and you affirm a type of freedom in the useless study, or forms of thought that have no immediate application, right? Or it's just like areas you said wild. So I'm curious for you, how do you see uselessness as affirmative and generative, or adding to the spaces, and can we find resistance in uselessness? And especially, where can this emerge, especially right now, like how the university is today?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the only thing that you can do if you want to push back. What's amazing to me, like, everybody who teaches university knows this, like, you always have a dean on your back that's like, please produce value. How are you going to produce value today for the university? And the irony is, like, if you say, well, actually, I don't want to do that, I want to do this, they'll be like, oh, we can make that into value. Right? So, like, remarkable, like, they'll even do the work for you. Like, if you don't figure out how to create value out of it, they'll figure out how to create value out of it. And so at a certain point in time, I just want to be like, well, actually, I'm going to work on being useless. I'm like devoting myself to doing things that you can't make value out of. It was the best way I could figure out how to draw a line in the sand, which is, I think, easier in some sense in fields that have been written off, right? So in creative writing, for instance, like, like, it's not that they won't try to create value out of it, but like, they're the first thing that people make fun of, in the neoliberal university. Why do we have creative writing programs? Who's going to be doing any of that? Unless they're making film, right? We can make movies or TV shows out of it. But in political science, it's just sort of given. You're going to produce reports that are good for things, right? Like, you're going to produce reports on, how to make the economy better, how to, you know, make democratic voting more efficient, you know, like it's just like, it's all about use value. And I wanted there to be some part, you know, there's that line in 1,000 Plateaus where they say, you know, you've got to hold on to a little plot of land just for yourself. Right? This is what they call the refrain. The refrain is that tune that a kid whistles to themselves so they don't forget who they are. I wanted a little space where what I did wasn't for something else. And I mean, we do that all the time. You know, there's a guitar hanging behind Alex. My guess is he's not monetizing whatever he plays on it on Spotify. You know, like if he's like me, like the reason you sit around and play the guitar is it's just satisfying. Like even when it's frustrating, it's like satisfying to play, and it has no value. And there I was reaching this point, and it's why I actually spent a large portion of COVID hanging out with chickens and building a guitar out of a monkey pod tree from down the street. But, you know, like there was a point in my career where I couldn't even read a novel without thinking, oh, this could be a great introduction to an article. Maybe actually I could turn this into a theory. Maybe this is an example I could make. You know, like I couldn't sit through a TV show with my kids or like a movie with my kids without being like, oh, wow, what a great example of the way that ... which, you know, felt commanding in all of the wrong ways, right? Like it seemed like the death of freedom. You know, I think about this a lot with like, you know, we have these like Althusserian moments where we're hailed right into the old ISA, which I love, by the way, that our yearly conference is already called the ISA, the International Studies Association, because then I can just think it's just the ideological state apparatus. But they have like t-shirts, they're like ISA 2020. You know, like what I was losing, right? Like that, you know, we've talked about this in class and reading group, and we had it, Amy, you know, where literacy becomes a kind of automated system. You can't look at a text without reading it. It's almost impossible. Right? When you're this embedded as we are in literacy, like you look at a text and you immediately read it. It's an automaticity. You can't appreciate the font. You can't appreciate the picture of the image, right? You just, like the words literally scream at you. You know, they just like scream off the page. And everything was becoming that way for me, because that's what getting tenure was about, and that's what, you know, trying to succeed in a career was about. And I was like, well, you know, fine, I can't unlearn reading, but could I get to a place where I could encounter an idea, or I could encounter a thing, and I could just encounter it for itself for like just a few seconds, right? Like where I could just encounter something. And my first sensibility wasn't, how do I cut its head off, debone it, and turn it into, you know, chicken strips. And that's hard work. It's actually not something you make as a decision. It's something you cultivate as a practice. And so that was one of the reasons why I sent out that crazy flyer, in part because I was also getting criticism from some members of my department that I was like doing too much. Like it wasn't for my tenure, you know, like I was doing these things that I shouldn't be doing. And more to the point, students were doing things they shouldn't be doing. So I sent out this random flyer for a reading group on useless theory, because like, how could they complain possibly that like I was impinging upon their territory or taking up students if we were, whatever we were doing, it was totally useless. You know, like it had no value. Don't worry. There was no credit, right? It wasn't going to help people's dissertations. It wasn't going to create like meaningful solutions for modern living. You know, it was just like, it just was whatever it was. And, you know, it's funny, you know, because now I'm basically teaching a class this semester, which is premised off the reading group. We're reading one book for the entire semester. It's like 20, 40 pages of reading a week. I refuse for people to be like, well, what's this for? And I think people are really enjoying, for the first time since COVID started, just like doing a little reading and having a conversation, because it takes a while. It's uncomfortable, but you start to remember that, you know, curiosity is a value, and just like feeling your brain make connections is a value, and like encountering the world differently because an idea slapped you upside the head is valuable. And it's not valuable in any kind of way that you can measure on an end of the year KPI report. And that's good. And it's more work. So that's the other problem, right? It is more work. It's exhausting. Having reading group every week, when I was also trying to get tenure, could be exhausting, but I got something from it, right? Which I don't think I could have gotten from something else. So, I really feel like, useless is sort of a ploy, right? Because, well, then it's useful, it brought you joy, that's always there's always some dumbass to say that to you. But I don't actually think that's what useful means, right? Useful means exchangeable, right? And exchangeability often requires homogenization, right? Not singularity, right? It has to have an accountability in the process of exchange. So I wanted non-exchangeable, singular moments of value. And I wanted to think about what it was to produce those in a way that wasn't just, rich people on cruise ships declaring themselves sovereign citizens. Freedom it's just been shit on by the worst human beings on the planet. And so if, I wanted to find some version of it that didn't feel like, Bitcoin.
So Harney and Moten refer to this dynamic as experimentation with the general antagonism. So this kind of reading group as a mode of study, and they refer to this as sort of, this experimentation, and they call it a riotous production of difference.
Yeah.
So our final question for you is about this production of difference. And your book, to come back to your book, Savage Ecology, it ends with a meditation on the question of apocalypse in the future. And you develop a notion of feral reason as an affirmation of difference within catastrophe. And feral is not a way out of apocalypse, but rather a way through it. And you write, what comes next is an effort to build capacities and intensities attuned to novelty that can remain political while also finding satisfaction and even inspiration in whatever comes next. Could you elaborate on this dynamic between apocalypse, difference, world, and feral reason, particularly as ways of thinking about the future? I'll
do my best. I think Harney and Moten's is more noble than mine. I love the undercommons. When I found the undercommons, I was like, thank you, previously called Jesus. It felt good to hear other people finding joy in the university without having to create a new field of study. The saddest thing that'll ever happen is when somebody gets the grant for a department.
Studies. That's inevitable, I think. Joy studies. Yeah.
Yeah, or undercommon studies. There'll be an anthropologist who's like, well, I've gone and I've surveyed all the undercommons. And here's what I find is the common characteristic in the creation of heterotopic spaces in asynchronous time. No dig on anthropologists. It could have just easily been sociologists. But, I think for me, they're right in that it's always fugitive. And I think that's what I was trying to account for with feral. There's a tendency in deep ecology and a lot of ecological thinking which wants to think about the feral, which is anti-human in a way that's not interesting to me, in the sense that it has a kind of antipathy towards the human rather than a desire for novelty. And what is for me inspirational, particularly about Moten, you read Black and Blur, there's nothing but inspiration there. There's antagonism, but there's no misanthropism, right? The misanthropy is not, there's no resentment, right? Right, in that sort of Nietzschean sense. And so similarly, I wanted feral to still bear a certain fidelity to reason. I don't think that reason is uninteresting. I just don't think it should be dominant. And so, I want to think about how to cultivate thinking as something which isn't rarefied or reified. That is something that's constantly practiced, which even is something you might want to get good at, but isn't something you'd want to be professional at. And I think that line, and I think the whole book is probably an experiment in this, because what the hell am I an expert in? But that that sort of line between amateurism and dilettantism is actually one that is only marginalized because we live in an era in which expertise has to be monetized. Being pretty good at a lot of things is actually great. And like experimenting with a lot of different things is like actually how you find new things and the joy that comes from finding new things. And I don't think that there's an apocalypse that can make that impossible. And so for me, I would rather people be stockpiling techniques for living with new differences and singularities than stockpiling canned goods and, you know, natural gas to make it through the next Texas snowpocalypse. And that's what I meant by feral reason, which is a way of holding on to the value of what I think is, you know, both the worst and best part of the origin of the university, right? Which is this pursuit of knowledge, this love of knowledge, at the expense of the practicality of the world. And there are ways in which that became an awful thing, right? Land grant schools are also settler colonial flagships. But there's also ways in which that became a beautiful thing, right? Where poetry happened and knowledge was saved by, you know, raiding awful people, and, you know, weird spaces were created for people to become something different than they were meant to be. And so, you know, I think feral reason for me is a kind of pedagogical demand on not what a new university could be, but what we should be looking for to hold on to in universities. Because like we're always going to be doing things with two hands, right? That's part of Moten and Harney's point. Like we're always going to be holding the deans at bay. That's just, I don't think that there's an end to that. I do think it's better when we're the deans. You know, I do think it's better like when there isn't a separate class of administrators and it rotates. You know, like I can think about more democratic ways to do it for sure, but still there will be this managerial urge in the formation of a university. But at the same time, as we like find better ways to sustain that and fend it off, we also have to find better places to hide from it and like recharge and find new things. And, you know, there is a bit of, I don't know how to say it, and I don't want to overstate it because I don't want to sound like Mark Lillo, but there is at times a kind of anti-intellectualism in the critique of the university. Like a kind of rejection of theory on the grounds that theory is a certain kind of power move. And of course it was, because what isn't? But it's also been this like moments of eruptive creativity, inspiration, you know, like, and so, you know, in the whole book, I want to try to hold on to both of those things at the same time. You know, I don't want to either excuse or, you know, or let go of, right? And I think that's a hard thing to do, but that's what I'm trying to do in that end is like, how can we think about more kinds of experiments? And, you know, a lot of people are like, oh, why didn't you talk about all the cool things indigenous people are doing? Or why didn't you detail all these other places where it's happening? And, you know, I think my answer is for the same reason, like I didn't join up to be an anthropologist in Iraq. I want to maybe, like if I'm really lucky, I'll inspire some of those things. If I'm even luckier, people will invite me into some of those things. And the last thing I want to do is leave behind a detailed diagram of how to target them and destroy them and take them to pieces. And I do think theory has this really really unhelpful theory, inspirational but unhelpful theory walks this really interesting line of being able to provide sustenance without providing a map where to find us. And I think that's really important. And I think we have to be really careful of that. One of the things about fetishizing resistance in the form of detailed elaborations of exactly how it took place and where it took place and who the actors were, although their names have been changed to protect the innocent, is that you're doing counterinsurgency, even if you don't want to. And I think theory is one of these weird places where we get to be ambivalently legible. And we get to play with that legibility. And of course, some people will figure it out. You know, of course, people have used 1,000 plateaus in war because they've used everything in war.
Doesn't the IDF, or hadn't they at some point read 1,000 plateaus?
It's a funny story. The Brigadier General Nevy, who used 1,000 plateaus, lost his job. But currently runs a consultant.
Maybe it didn't have quite the exact effect that he wanted it to. Maybe,
but they run the hottest consultant.
From it.
Yeah, they run the hottest consultancy in DC with Petraeus and Kilcullen. So Kilcullen, Neve, and Petraeus all run this like weird homo counterinsurgency private organization in DC. So yeah, I mean, all that stuff can go badly, but you know, like that, yeah. So, you know, I want to create a space where we ought not feel a sense of guilt for trying to have fun with ideas.
I think that's a beautiful moment to wrap what has been a truly fascinating conversation. And we want to thank you again so much for joining us today to have this conversation. And hopefully we can
Thanks for having me.
do it again too at some point in the future.
Yeah, well, thanks for creating a space for ideas, even if they were mine.